Okay. We are recording. I am going to share my screen. No, not that. I don't want to do that.
Can I let everybody in the waiting, let everybody in yet?
Not yet. I just lost something. Where did you are screen sharing. This is what we want to see. Is that sharing, Monica?
Yes, it is, but it's only a quarter of the screen or less.
Okay, then I have to fix that.
Maximize your PowerPoint.
Okay, first of all, play from the start. Is that okay?
Yes.
So I also want to, let me go back. We don't.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Thank you. Let me escape for a moment. It doesn't want to let me escape. Monica, how do I escape so I can put my music on?
Hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen so you get your icons.
Yeah, they're not wanting to come up.
Then you have to minimize the screen for a second so you can access your other icons.
Thanks, love. That helps. Okay, so let's let them in, Monique.
Okay. All coming in.
Before we speak.
Love that song.
Do I still wake you up every morning, James?
Yes.
Oh, good. I don't know if we should tell everyone, but
Before we go to you, you're already near us, in us and above us, eternal and unseen. You live in us, you're the only one, our God. We love you for your dare to be with us here. justice be done. Clear the allayed power of peace, bread to be broken and joy to be shared. This is our hope for now and always.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you heard the Father James Martin, Sister Kathleen Deignan duet on that opening prayer of ours for this evening, which I think is a perfect prayer for our conversation tonight. It's the words of the song, where before we speak, you've already heard us. You are the only one, our God. And it's that wonderful mystery of presence and receptivity and intimacy and friendship that we're going to be exploring tonight with our very, very special guest, Father James Martin, a Jesuit with an exceptional ministry that I'd like to spend a little time sharing with you about. But first, I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome all of our friends who are familiar with and share friendship with us in the Deignan Institute for Earth and Spirit, and among our friends in the Berry Forum. But I really want to welcome our newcomers, perhaps, folks through the Iona community, especially my old students. If there are any of you out there, I want you to know that I am sending the warmest embrace to you, to your families. So many people made reservations to be with us tonight, and I'm delighted. Let me just say, before we begin, something about how this evening will work. It's going to be my joy to engage my vow of conversation with Father Jim Martin, and he and I will explore something of his book and something of the greater landscape that his book is illuminating for us this evening. And then we will have a good lengthy opportunity for all of you who wish to enter into conversation with Father Jim yourself. And the way that you will do this is that you will put your question or your comment in the chat box, and our friend Brother Kevin Cawley will sift through those and offer them to James when that time comes. So let me just say that we are recording this, and also that it will be posted for you to return to again. So why a vow of contemplation? Why, conversation rather? I let the cat out of the bag there. Both Father Jim and myself are great disciples, I'd say, we'll see if James will agree, of Thomas Merton. And he has been a tremendous influence in my life and my ministry. We began this initiative called the Merton Contemplative Initiative at Iona. And the form it's taking right now is a vow of conversation. That is to say, these opportunities to engage with really, really wisdom voices from our culture, from our Christian community, from the multiple religious communities across the board. And the reason why it's called a vow of conversation is because that is what Thomas Merton himself desired to make. The chosen vows, so to speak, was to make of his life a conversation with the people of our culture, with the people of the world who were seeking the great mystery and intimacy with great mystery. And so that is why we will have these conversations, and hopefully as they build up, they will begin to comprise a kind of wisdom school. And our wonderful guest this evening is Father James Martin. So let me welcome him. Greetings to you once again. Jim, it's so good to see you, and you're so very generous to be with us.
Thank you. Well, greetings to you, and thank you for that song. I don't know if I'm on the screen, but I can show everyone my phone that has, just to prove it, I listen to your album Ave almost every day. And so funny enough, when I was listening to you sing, I thought, oh, it's time for me to get up because that's my morning song. I think that is one of the most beautiful albums. And as I think I told you when I first met you, I feel like I'm meeting a rock star, whenever I'm speaking with you. So just thank you for your ministry. It continues to help us pray. It's just so beautiful. So I'm really happy to be with you for many reasons, to have this vow of conversation, but also to tell you how grateful I am for your ministries, plural.
Thank you, James. That's very, very mutual. And I want to be able to share with folks what the vastness, the range of your work is. And I want to salute you for it. And I want to say that it is so absolutely important for our moment. I think I was reading in American Magazine, you may know that, it's a really significant Jesuit weekly, that I'm teasing because, of course, Father James is one of the editors of America. Mm-hmm. But recently there was a little article that allowed the Pope to express his real concern about the state of the soul of the human species. I mean, it was that big. It wasn't just anything so particular or limited, but he was speaking about, in a sense, an anthropological problem, a spiritual anthropological problem, which is this desertification and this tremendous hunger that is overtaking the human family. And one of the things I think we're aware of, Father Jim, is that we live in a time of a great turning. There really is a tremendous turning of the human in a global way toward the fuller life, the deeper life, the more expansive and awake and conscious life. And across the religious traditions, by whatever skillful means a particular religion will offer them, we are seeing people appropriating all of the good tools, all of the skillful means to be able to do this. And you have been doing this for decades now. I mean, I remember when you came on the scene and were a young, brand new Jesuit. But this was always your focus, it seems to me, animating the faith life of seekers. I don't even want to constrain it to Christians, because it's always for you been more than that. But would you like to talk to us a little bit by way of beginning about your ministry and what you're up to in this world? And I mean that in the deepest sense.
Yeah, that's very lovely. And it's so wonderful to be with you. So for those who may not know me, I'm a Jesuit priest. I won't give you my whole life story, but I'm a Jesuit priest. I entered the Society of Jesus in 1988. And in my formation, we are encouraged to work with the poor, a lot of times people who are on the margins. And so I worked with homeless people, people who were sick, street gangs. I was in East Africa for 2 years. I worked with inmates in a Boston jail all along studying, philosophy and theology, and ordained in 1999 as a priest. And then, as Kathleen was saying, ever since 1999, I've been working in America Magazine, now America Media. And I see my role as I'm a writer as well as a Jesuit priest. So I would say I'm a Jesuit priest who happens to write, not the other way around. And it all flows out of my desire to help people encounter God. And you're right, it is the fundamental desire that I have is to help people find God in their lives and whoever they are. And so the books that I've written have been about the saints. This is what you're seeing on the screen is a video based on my book, My Life with the Saints. I've written a book about Jesus, books about Jesuit spirituality. Probably the most controversial one was on LGBTQ people, which came out a few years ago. They're all my books. And then I just have one that came out recently called Learning to Pray, which came out last week, which is it's the longest treatment that I've had on prayer. There you see the cover in the middle. That's the longest treatment I have on prayer. And it really is a guide for everyone. I feel that one of the difficulties with spiritual books sometimes is that they make it very mysterious. They talk about the fruits of prayer and God feeling close. And I remember when I was a Jesuit novice, and maybe this is your experience too, Kathleen, I didn't know what people were talking about. What are you talking about? So in the book, it's very simple. I say, what does happen during prayer? And this is based on my experience as someone who prays, as a prayer. There's no good English word for that. And as someone who is a spiritual director. So I talk about what happens, insights, emotions, memories, desires, feelings, all the kinds of things that come up. So it is the whole project is really the same thing, which is trying to help people encounter God. So that's what I've been trying to do as a Jesuit, sometimes more successfully than others.
Well, I want to say, James, that I had a Jesuit novitiate as well, because when I came to the Congregation of Notre Dame at 18, within a few months, I found myself on the long retreat. So we did the 30-day retreat. My spiritual director at that time was the extraordinary George Aschenbrenner.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes. So just having said that, how deep the immersion was for those of us who came to the Congregation of Notre Dame in the spirituality of Ignatius. So we want to really give you an opportunity to open up that treasure trove to us. Let me just, oops, sorry, I want to proceed here. But I want to say, just to be able to give the dimensions of your own personal ministry. And I think where prayer brings us, it brings us from the mat or the chair or the kneeler or the chapel or my bedroom into Congress, as you see yourself here. One of the marvelous things about Christian spirituality, I think, in our time, is that it is as Paul would say, it is the dunamis, it is the dynamite of God. It is a powerful, powerful energy that takes us out of ourselves and brings us into the service of the world and the transformation of the world. So it's almost like multiple transformations going on in the contemplative practice. I'm transformed, but then as I present myself and that energy of presence that I bear, the world begins to change, and that's such an important piece.
I think that's right. And I think that some people will say, you know, how does prayer motivate us, right? Because that can seem like you sit down, as you say, you sit down in your chair, you have a nice experience with God, or you have some insight or memory or desire or feel God's presence. And then what's the connection between that and your what I call your walking around life? And I think one of the main connections is that I believe, and I think most people would say this, that God raises things up in our prayer for us to be attentive to. So at a very simple level, if you are praying and you feel yourself moved by a story that you've heard on TV or online about refugees or migrants or the poor, or even if you're reading something and you're really profoundly moved, or you pass a homeless person on the street and you're thinking about that person later on, I believe that those emotions and those feelings that you're having are the way that God has of moving you to action, right? And on a say less sort of activist level, you could say that if you're praying about a friend of yours who's lonely and you feel this great sense of sorrow for her or for him, that may be God awakening in you this desire to help the person. So, how else would God move you? How else would God move individuals other than by moving them through their prayer? So, and I don't want to just focus it just on the time that you're praying, the one-on-one time with God, although that's very important. It can be when you're walking around and not sort of conscious of God. But I think that for me, it's that connection that God's desires are fulfilled by raising up desires in us, right? That if we're paying attention to them, if we really are, which is difficult, we will see God's plans for the world, right? And that includes our own vocations. So I think for me, that's the link. It's God's activity within us. And one of the things I think that's been helpful for me is, and Kathleen, you talked about bringing in seekers, is that I think a lot of people aren't encouraged to think about it in that way, right? So if they pass a homeless person on the street, or if they see someone who's poor or read an article, right, they might feel this real deep sense of just, in a sense, sometimes confusion, sometimes anger, sometimes frustration, sometimes this shouldn't be the way things are. And I think many people feel that, but they're not encouraged to think about that as God's communicating with them. And so for me, that's the link. And the first step is to admit the possibility that this is in fact more than just your own feelings. This is God working. This is the Holy Spirit working through you.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about your book, James, is that, you first of all, it's so compendious. You really take us through the entire landscape of at least Christian prayer. And so in that sense, it's almost like a map, and it's almost like an itinerary too, because you give us the pattern and the steps that we can walk through any of these prayer modalities, which are not just a collection of different modalities, but they're really, as we appropriate them, they become integral to the prayer life that's beginning to be fostered in us. When you spoke about reading the paper, I find that in some ways my Lectio Divina in the morning is reading the Times or reading America or reading something that matters. And I find myself being profoundly moved. And then I do find myself being energetically moved. to act somehow, to connect, to do something by way of solidarity. And, you know, in your book, you have a chapter on Lectio Divina. And Lectio Divina is almost always understood as sacred reading, the reading of the scriptures or the sacred texts. But I think, as Thomas Merton would say, you know, the sacred texts are the scriptures, but they are the newspaper as well. I guess I would love to hear you say something about how Merton has brought you into your ministry.
Well, and you are right. I do consider myself a disciple. It's funny, Kathleen, he died, as you know, at age, what was it, 53, 54? Yes. And I'm 60 now. And so it's a very strange thing to look at someone who's younger than I am as a kind of spiritual master. But I think the Holy Spirit, you know, doesn't care about people's ages. So Merton, I always say as a joke, the four people who are most responsible for my vocation are the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and Thomas Merton. I'm not putting him up there with those three, but I knew nothing about religious orders, truly about religious life. I was working at GE after graduating from the Wharton School of Business. I worked for GE for 6 years. I was in finance. And I really felt stuck. I felt, you know, business is a real vocation for a lot of people, maybe a lot of people on this call, but I felt stuck and I was a square peg in a round hole. And I came home one night and turned on the TV on PBS, Channel 13. I was in Connecticut. Oh. And there was Paul Wilkes, Merton, a film biography on. And I think it's no more than an hour. It might even be a half an hour. And it just captivated me. I had no idea who this person was. No idea. I didn't really understand what a Trappist was. I sort of understood what a monk was. And his life was so interesting and so beautiful and in a sense romantic. I think that's one way that God has of drawing us. I talk about that in the book, you know, this sort of attraction, these desires. That I found his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain. I'm sure everybody has read it on this call. And that prompted me to think about doing something different. And I stumbled around and found the Jesuits. I knew I didn't think I could be a Trappist, but he's remained my, I would say my avatar. And I even when I write, I find that his writing, you know, it's sort of the confessional writing, the sort of narrative theology that he does has been very influential. And I think one of the most profound quotes in his work, which I wrote a whole book about him called Becoming Who You Are, is for me to be a saint means to be myself. And I just found that's the epigraph from my book, My Life with the Saints, which is basically about how all the saints were themselves. And it's something that I think that people still struggle with. So not only that they are enough, you know, as who they are. I was just directing a young man today who's struggling with that. But that their way of being holy is just as valid as, you know, Kathleen Deignan or Jim Martin or Mother Teresa or Pope John Paul or Pope Francis. It's a hard truth for people to really accept. On the face of it, they say, of course. But then when they live their lives out, you find people, and I'm sure you experience this, who say, oh, I'm just a, you know, fill in the blank, whatever the just is. I'm just a whatever, grandmother. I'm just a sister, or I'm just a accountant. No, there's no one who's just. And I think that quote for me really was transformative. For me to be a saint means to be myself. It's stunning. I would say if he had written nothing else, that would have been enough.
Thank you so much. I really, of course, he is the inspiration of this vow of conversation, and he's actually the inspiration for the whole project of the Institute for Earth and Spirit. James, I also want to just say that I'm really very aware, again, of the scope of your ministry and how you are standing in your place, rooted in your Jesuitical nature, and yet you are present to our culture in so many different ways. And I think that, you are becoming a near occasion of grace for a lot of people as we bump into you. whether we bump into you in your program on Facebook, as the slide is showing here. Want to just tell everybody, Father Jim has a marvelous ministry on Facebook. You can go there actually maybe tonight or tomorrow, and he'll be there able to talk with you. You can see one of his programs, which really are a kind of cultural, spiritual guidance drop-in center. And it's wonderful. Or to go to his Faith in Focus programs. Or he seems to be the honorary chaplain of the Stephen Colbert show, the night show, the late show. So talk to us about that. How do you feel about that? You're really out. You have, it is a Jesuitical thing, isn't it? I mean, there are no cloisters for you folks.
Yeah, right. The
Baseball
world is
caps.
the world is our monastery, as we say.
Yeah.
You know, it's a thank you. It's an outgrowth of the work I do at America Media, and it's a ministry of the word, basically. So I think it's very similar to your ministry in the sense with this institute and with your music. It's just an outgrowth of your vocation, right? As a sister and as a Catholic and as a theologian. And I just find that there are so many opportunities to meet people where they are, to really find people where they are. And one of the places where they are these days is on social media. And so I like to tell this story, if you don't mind. One of the things that I think about when I think about Jesus, and I love telling this story. So Jesus, the old saying is God meets people where they are. And I always like to remind people that Jesus met people where they were in two ways. So when you think about the call of the first disciples, Peter and Andrew and James and John, he goes from Nazareth to Capernaum to the Sea of Galilee to meet them there. So in other words, he doesn't wait for them to come to him, right? Which was the way that things were done back in those days, that the student would seek out the teacher. No, he goes to them. So he literally goes to where they are. And then when he's there, I just love this. When he's there, how does he speak to Peter and Andrew and James and John? Well, he doesn't use the language of a carpenter, right? He's been a carpenter for 18 years. He doesn't say, he could use the language of a carpenter. Come after me and we will build up the reign of God, right? Come after me and we will lay the foundations, some carpentry image.
Right.
No, he says to them, come after me and I will make you fishers of people, right? And then we know it's people, not just men. He's speaking to them in their language. And so he goes to where they are, not only physically, but then when he's with them, he speaks to them in their language. And so for me, Kathleen, the ministry on social media and the ministry even on the late night show is going to where people are physically, right? Or virtually, but also speaking in their language. And I just think that's it. And the other thing, just very quickly, when he does that miracle for Peter in the Gospel of Luke, which is a little different, he does the miraculous catch of fish, that even the miracle is in that language that Peter understands. Fish.
Wow.
That's the language. And, you think Peter might have seen, his mother-in-law be healed, or maybe the man with the withered hand be healed, or the demoniac in the synagogue be healed. And he might have said, well, that's interesting, but fish, he knew.
He got it.
He got that. So I think that we should, as you do so well in your ministry, we go where people are and we speak in their language, and it shouldn't be beneath us to do that, even on Twitter or on Instagram, because that's where people are and we need to meet them where they are.
Thank you. Let me see what's on our next page of images. Yes. I wanted to say to you, James, I'm sure people have reflected this to you, and I hope in your prayer you've accepted it and are grateful for the beauty of your nature. You have a beautiful nature.
Thanks.
And it's very warm, and it's very open and hospitable and non-judgmental. It's very witty, and in the best sense, it's charming. But you've got spine. You've really got spine. And I would like you to be able to talk about some of the more challenging things that face us as Christians within our society, as people of faith within our society, that we need to engage in our prayer and in our lives. And this, of course, is a photograph of you being received by Pope Francis, who has, well, you tell us the story. What's your latest appointment?
Yeah. So, yeah, and it relates to your question. So that is in September, I think 30th in 2019, and I was appointed to a very low level appointment in the Vatican's what's called the Dicastery for Communication, which was a surprise for me. And that's the group that oversees all the external communications in the Vatican. So the press office, L'Osservatore Romano, everything that comes out, the Pope's Twitter account. And around a few months after I was appointed, that was in March 2017, I believe, my book, Building a Bridge, came out, which was about reaching out to the LGBT community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community. And that did sort of call on my reserves of having a spine, because it was very well received, but also got a lot of pushback from people who didn't like what I was saying, even though it wasn't challenging any church teaching. And it's a long story, but basically, there was a lot of pushback, and then there was the pushback to the pushback, which included various bishops and even the Vatican inviting me to give a talk at the World Meeting of Families, and it culminated, believe it or not, in this invitation from the Pope to have an audience with him. Which, let me just say, people look at that picture. That does not happen to me every day. I've never. That's a high point of my life. It is not like I'm a cardinal that goes into the Vatican a lot.
It only needs to happen once.
What's that?
It only needs to happen.
Yes, once. That's it. And I can say he asked me to keep certain things private, so we could speak freely. But we spoke for a half an hour about ministry to LGBT people. And on the right in the picture, you see an empty chair. That's where the translator sat. And so it was just the three of us for half an hour talking about that stuff. And I felt really just so encouraged and inspired. And I go back to that moment whenever I need some uplift, but I really go back to, I go back to my prayer, which has helped to sort of invite me into more freedom. And very briefly, the key moment for me in prayer was when I was praying with the rejection at Nazareth, which everyone knows is when Jesus stands up in the temple, in the synagogue in Nazareth, and says he's the Messiah, and people are opposed to him and drive him out of the synagogue and drive him to the brow of a hill where they're going to kill him, which we tend to downplay sometimes. And I was praying on retreat. I was up at Linwood Spiritual Center, which I'm sure you know, up in Rhinebeck. And my retreat director said, why don't you pray about this? And I remember thinking that, normally when you hear that passage, it's how often people disregard the familiar or the obvious or the ordinary as carriers of God. So the people in Nazareth didn't understand that Jesus was, who he was because he was so familiar, which is true. But this time I started to see it from Jesus's point of view. And I thought, well, how were you able to do those things before all those people you knew, right? Nazareth is a small town, and how were you able to do that? And the words that came to me in prayer, not hearing them, but sort of intuiting them or feeling them, was Jesus saying to me, must everyone like you? Right? Does everyone have to like you? And it was an invitation to be free of the need to be loved, liked, or approved of. And so that's been, for me, the key moment of the last couple of years in terms of this ministry, because it has gotten a lot of pushback, and it continues to, and misunderstanding. But I am, moving towards the freedom not to be, the freedom from the need to be liked and loved and approved of. So so that flowed from my prayer. The ability, I would say, to do the ministry flowed from my prayer. But that moment with Francis was just, I'll tell you something I don't normally tell too many people. When I left that room, so to the right of the picture is a door, and that's the exit. I truly felt for the first time in my life that, you hear this, I was walking on air. I actually felt lighter. I thought, and I actually thought, well, my shoes feel different. So there must be some psychological thing that's going on. So it was a really graced moment for me.
I'm sure it was a graced moment for your brother Jesuit as well. You're helping me just in that story. I'm thinking as you're speaking of what happened to you in that direction to go into that particular gospel. But I'm thinking to myself, Jesus in the desert had to go through that similar purgation of wanting to be admired, of wanting to be loved and approved of. I mean, wasn't that one of the temptations, that he would be adulated? As you speak and as I read your book, Jim, I realize what an incredibly dynamic ground the inner life is. And as you offer to us, particularly all of the wonderful resources of the Ignatian tradition to learn how to pray. And do you think that maybe it would be helpful for our folks to just rehearse something of, oh, that computer went off, so that's not going to work. But you must have a copy of your book in front of you. I read it on Kindle.
I do.
So if you could go through and would you just walk us through ever so simply the major chapters and the progression that you would bring someone like me who wants to learn to pray. And by the way, I think I'm always a novice. So
we are. That's why I called it learning to pray. So you want me to sort of move through the book briefly?
Yes, the major chapters.
Yeah.
And what I'd like folks to do while Father Jim is talking is please remember that you're to put your questions or comments in the chat box and we will offer them to him.
Let me just quickly get a copy. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. So while Father Jim is doing that, I'll just invite you to take a look at some of the other things that he's doing here.
Yeah, so basically the book is, as Kathleen was saying, it is comprehensive. It is kind of an overview of the prayer life, the life of prayer. And basically it starts off with the chapter, Everyone Can Pray, okay, which is that to me is one of the key pieces of advice in the book, because most people think that they cannot. It moves on to the kinds of prayer that you have as a child, the kinds of prayer that you have when you're young, that God reaches out to us. And then it launches into, I would say, kind of overviews of prayer. So definitions of prayer, why people pray, what is prayer. And then one of the great insights for me was from Father Bill Barry, who I'm sure you know, was a great spiritual director and a great mentor of mine, that talked about prayer as friendship, right? Friendship with God, and the things that you can say about a good friendship that requires time, honesty, change, openness, that you can say about your relationship with God. And then I move into one of the hearts of the book, which is talking about different ways of praying. And so first, petitionary prayer, right? We all need to ask for things. Rote prayers, which I think sometimes get denigrated. The daily examination of conscience, which is a review of the day. And then the real heart of the prayer, which I alluded to earlier, which is the real heart of the book, which is what happens when you pray. And I think this is one of the main reasons I wrote the book, because when I was a novice, I really had no idea what people were talking about. What is actually supposed to happen? When I close my eyes, don't tell me it's the fruits of prayer and God will feel close. What does that mean? Does that mean that I hear voices or see visions or see words or phrases? What am I supposed to do and what's supposed to happen? So I talk about what comes up, which are emotions, insights, memories, desires, images, words, feelings, and mystical experiences. Then I go into knowing what is God's voice and what is not God's voice before we move on to Ignatian
Very
Contemplation.
helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, because that's another sort of big mystery, because not everything that pops in your mind is right, is God's voice.
Right. And we
And
talking
please.
about this process or this practice or this intuitive, this sense of discernment, of being able to feel the movement of the spirit in us, and when it's leading us, when it's a projection of our own ego, or when it's really authentic. So really important for our moment.
Yeah, and it takes a while for people to get a sense of how to recognize God's voice. And I offer some pretty simple tips on not only how to recognize God's voice and like the sort of words and phrases that might come up. That's not always the case, but in terms of the movements within you, right? Ignatius, one of the shorthands is that for Ignatius, the voice of God is always the voice of hope, right? The voice of uplift, the voice of consolation. The voice that is not coming from God is the one that says everything's hopeless. So I talk about discerning those kinds of things, and then really in succession talk about Ignatian Contemplation, Lectio Divina, which is sacred reading, and then centering prayer, what I call nature prayer, which is finding God in nature. And then rounding off the book is talking about prayer, spiritual direction, retreats, those kinds of things. And then the ups and downs of the spiritual life, challenges, mainly dryness and desolation, and then moving from prayer to action. So it really is, I really wanted to pour everything that I knew about prayer into this book, and to be a kind of carry along spiritual director for people that might not have a spiritual director. And I tried to anticipate and answer all the questions that I would imagine people have. And, because I've been asked these questions over the last 20 years as a spiritual director, they're very common questions that people ask about prayer, about the examination of conscience, about Ignatian contemplation, about discernment. So I put them all in. There are some very common questions. And so they're all in the book, and at least as many as I could fit.
Well, before we really open this up to a wider conversation, would you answer some of my questions?
Sure.
So I would love it if I could hear you say and distill for us, what is Ignatian contemplation as opposed to Carmelite contemplation, or as opposed to the prayer of the cloud of unknowing, or any of the other spiritual schools, the schools of spirituality and prayer that we have?
Well, I would say I might not be able to be as articulate on the other schools, but I think I do know I can talk about Ignatian contemplation. So it's a tradition, I would say, popularized by Saint Ignatius, not invented by Saint Ignatius, but popularized, where you use your imagination in particular. I mean, there are lots of different schools there's lots of different Ignatian practices, but the one that most people are talking about when they talk about Ignatian contemplation is using your imagination. So what does that mean?
That's what I want you to help me with.
Yeah, sure. So what it means is you imagine yourself, for example, and most frequently in a scripture scene. Okay, so recently Jesus has been doing in the Gospels over the last few days a lot of healing, right? He's been exercising people. And so if you're doing, for example, the story of the man with the possessed man in the synagogue at Capernaum, right? The one who comes up and says, I know who you are. What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? And Jesus says, be quiet, come out of him. Ignatian contemplation would ask you to, as Ignatius says, compose the place. So what do I see? I mean, literally, what is, as you're imagining it, what do I see? What does Jesus look like? What does the possessed man look like? What does the synagogue look like? How many people are there? Are the disciples there? What do I hear? Well, I mean, if a man's coming into the synagogue who's possessed, he's probably ranting and raving. What does Jesus's voice sound like? What do I feel? What am I wearing? Is it hot? Is it cold? Am I packed in with a lot of people? Is it just a sort of sparse crowd that day? What do I smell? Right. Well, I mean, you're right near the Sea of Galilee. Are you smelling kind of the air, the kind of the sea air? And one thing that this is not maybe as important in this particular meditation, but what do I taste, right? If you're at the miracle of the loaves and the fishes or the wedding feast of Cana, it's about taste. And basically, you're putting yourself in that scene and you're trusting, this is really key, you're trusting that God is going to be able to work through your imagination, right? And so some of the things that come up in your prayer, as you notice, right, are things that God might be raising for you. So let's say something as simple as in this meditation, you're suddenly afraid of the demoniac, of the possessed man, and you're surprised about that, and that actually, oh, that's something you haven't thought about before. This is actually frightening, right? You may have seen it in the movies or imagined it, but it's scary to see this man who's ranting and raving and screaming at Jesus, and maybe dangerous, right? Maybe you've run across people like that who have, all sorts of problems, and you have a sense of fear, and you see how Jesus is able to counteract that with his calm. He says, just be quiet. And that might bring something up in you, right? And so something about your own life, something about how you have to trust that God can calm even things that frighten you. You might have that insight. So an insight might come up. You might have an emotion of a desire to be with someone like Jesus who is calm. I want to be someone who's calm. I want to follow Jesus. You might have a memory of a time where you felt that you were healed. So the point is that in Ignatian contemplation, the story can become your own, sometimes in a much deeper way than if it was told to you. So if you're listening to a homily and the person says, now notice how Jesus confronts someone who's frightening, and we should never be afraid of anything with Jesus's help. Okay, that's a nice insight that you might hear in a homily or read in a book. It's another thing to experience it yourself. Right. It's something that you trust that God is raising up for you for a particular reason. And it just becomes more personal. So in Ignatian contemplation, we ask God to work through our imaginations, which is really a gift. It's a gift that God gives us to imagine ourselves back in the time of Jesus, or even in Old Testament times. So that's a kind of little précis of Ignatian contemplation.
Yeah, but that's so helpful to me. Thank you. I have to say that that's been a stumbling block for me in the Ignatian school. I don't know why, but I haven't been as comfortable entering into that kind of imaginal prayer. And you're helping me realize right now, because you kept using the word trust, that we have to trust that God can be with us in the imaginal realm, in the realm of the imagination, and can open us and deepen us and awaken us. Because that example you gave is very, very illuminating to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I do want to respond to that, because I think that's a lot of people's experience. I would say a couple of things. First of all, not everyone feels comfortable in this kind of prayer, and that's okay, right? There are many different kinds of prayer. There's all sorts of kinds of prayer that I talk about in my book. But second of all, I think, to your point, that a lot of people sometimes have a hard time trusting that God could work this way. And I think I tell a story in the book about how I said to my first spiritual director, well, that sounds ridiculous. I said, well, it's just like making things up in my head. What is that? Is that's the big Ignatian Jesuit tradition? You just imagine things in your head? And he said to me, well, look, do you believe that relationships are one way that God can sort of work through you? Can God work through your relationships? I said, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Can God work through like nature and art? Oh, of course. Can God work through the sacraments? Oh, of course. Can God work? And he went through this whole list, and he said, why can't God work through your imagination? Why could you not say that this is a gift that God has given us? So I think, Kathleen, that's a lot of people's experience. And the other thing I really liked was, which I put in the book, the book is also a compendium of, and including George Aschenbrenner, the book is a compendium of wisdom figures and their advice. One person's, Bill Barry, said to be comfortable with the imagination that you have, right? And so if your imagination imagines it in a particular way, maybe a simple bare bones way, that's fine. because we all have an imagination. As Bill Barry says again, if when someone is telling the story of hitting their finger with a hammer and you wince, you have an imagination. So yeah, it is. A lot of it is really trust that God has given you this gift of the imagination, that your imagination is sufficient, and that God in some way will work through those stories with you. So it is sort of, for me, the primary way that I pray, actually.
Well, I have to thank you for that, because I feel like I'm being given a gift.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Glad.
I am grateful. I want to ask my colleagues, Brother Kevin, how are we doing in the chat space? Are folks asking questions?
Yes, people have been pushing questions out there. Would you like to hear one or two that seem to be?
Yes, I'm not sure I'm finished grilling, James, but yes, let's.
You want me to wait for a few minutes?
No, I think we should let some other folks speak. Then I would love you, Father Jim, to come back to the examen.
Sure.
I think that that's a very powerful gift that your tradition offers us.
Happy to.
Okay.
Good evening, Jim. This is Kevin. Two things that are going on here. One of them has to do with the prayer conversation that we've been all listening to. And the other one has to do actually with some real life challenges. So let me just look at the questions about the prayer issues. One of them has to do, I'll give you the two questions at the same time. You can handle them as you like. The first one had to do with the inner room idea. How do you work with that when so often people have been told, go to the sea, go to the mountain, but yet there's an inner room experience that might be very important for people to understand. And then the second part of that has to do with, can you say something more about the experience of consolation and desolation in prayer?
Yeah. So the first question, it sounds like that means the inner room experience would be kind of praying on your own. Is that the idea?
That's what
Versus
it sounded like, yes.
Yeah. So look, I think one of the things I say in the book, and I really believe, is that whatever way you pray is fine. Okay. So for some people, they do enjoy praying outdoors by the ocean, taking a walk, riding a bike, being in nature. That's fine. Right. And I talk about ways of encountering God in nature. That is great. Okay. Other people find that distracting. I will say, for me, I find, someone said to me, what's your favorite place to pray? And I said, in my room, because it's just distracting to me. That's okay too. Right. I think that people are called to try both. Right. And whatever you find helpful, whatever helps you to be more contemplative, to experience God, to basically encounter God in prayer is fine. If it's by the ocean, fine. If it's in your room, fine. If it's kneeling, fine. If it's lying down, that's fine. So I would say it's both end. And I think you need to try it too, because I think oftentimes people are told that this other way of prayer, whatever it is not real prayer. Okay. If you're walking around, it doesn't count. Right. In terms of consolation and desolation, those are kind of specific Ignatian terms. And Ignatius means by consolation, anything that builds you up, right? Encourages you, gives you hope. Ignatius says only God can cause that. By contrast, desolation is when you are cast down, when you feel hopeless, despairing. Now, they're different than psychological experiences, right? You don't feel like God is anywhere to be found, right? So you can say, like, you can be sad, but still feel a sense of God's presence, right? So, let's say you're at a funeral and you're very moved by the homily or the music. You feel God's presence. You're not in desolation, right? It's not happy and sad. It's an experience of feeling God's presence and not feeling God's presence. So Ignatius talks about how to understand those in the spiritual life, and also how to, in a sense, use them as ways that God has of leading you. I will say to people who are listening, because we're speaking during the pandemic, that one of the easiest shorthands for Ignatian contemplation in the midst of a pandemic is this: the voice of God is the voice of hope. Okay. And the voice of not from God, sometimes called the evil spirit, is the voice of despair. Okay. So that's a very easy way of sort of understanding those voices. And any voice that comes from within you, right, or even people that are telling you these things that are uplifting and hopeful and comforting, in a sense, giving you a sense of uplift, that's coming from God. The voices that are saying it's hopeless, this is despairing, this will never work, that's not coming from God. So that's consolation and desolation.
Thank you, Jim. Kathleen, shall we keep going, or would you want to
Yeah,
get some other
we have
things
some more.
happening before we have several more questions? Yeah, one of them has to do with it's a bit poignant. It relates to a few moments ago when we watched Jim sitting with Pope Francis and the book of the reaching out to the LGBT community. And the person is asking about this statement, love the sinner, hate the sin. And the person reports this has become harmful and hurtful to LGBTQ people, even when it's spoken within the family confines. And they're wondering, is there something that Jim might want to say to that expression?
Yeah, it's used almost exclusively about LGBT people. So now we are all sinners, like all of us, right? I mean, including me and Kathleen, none of us are perfect. I mean, I don't see Jesus or Mary on this call tonight. So we're all sinful. We're all struggling. Okay. And yet it is the LGBT person to whom that comment is addressed. Okay. Now, if it were addressed to everybody, right? Love the sinner, hate the sin, that would be fine. But we don't do that. And I'll give you an example of why it's so harmful to people, because you're basically calling, the LGBT person sinful just for being who they are. I mean, imagine saying this to a 14 or 15-year-old, teenager, right? Who's coming to understand his or her sexuality, love the sin, hate the sinner. I love the sinner, hate the sin. Well, what has this person done? One of the examples I use is college students. So as we know from research, a significant number of college students are sexually active. Okay, we know that. Okay, and this is not in keeping with church teaching. They're sexually active. Now, if I were to say to you, I'm going to speak to a group of college kids, you would never say, well, love the sinner, hate the sin. You would say, oh, that's wonderful. Have a wonderful time with these college students. Or if I were to go and speak to a group of married people, as we know, the majority of married couples in the Catholic Church use birth control, right? Which is, technically a sin in the Catholic Church. No one would, if I said, I'm going to give a talk to married people, well, Father, love the sinner, hate the sin. No one speaks to people like that. No one talks about people in those terms except the LGBT person. And so that's really used as I find a very, demeaning, pejorative, and really targeting phrase just for the LGBT person. So, like I said, in the abstract, it makes sense, right? We hate the sin and we love the sinner, but the fact that it's only applied to LGBT people, I think, makes it really problematic. And so, I agree with this person who's saying it's difficult when they hear that.
Yes. So I'm sure that was an answer that's been soothing to that person. One other question that has come in recently looks provocative. A person says that a priest told me once that only a person of faith can receive prayers offered on their behalf. According to this report, God just passes on a person without faith in terms of prayer. The question to you is, what do you think?
I think that God doesn't really pass on anybody. I think that, faith is a gift, of course. It's also something you have to work at, but I think God is calling everyone. I think God is inviting everyone to encounter God, right, in all sorts of moments in our lives. But I think, as I said earlier, that one of the problems is that we're not encouraged to see those as moments of invitation. And sometimes people do turn away from it. They, when Jesus says to Peter and Andrew and James and John and Mary Magdalene and all the other women disciples, follow me, they could have said no. So it is a choice. But the idea that, for example, God's going to kind of give up on somebody, I just think that doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't make sense in terms of the compassion and the mercy that God has, which is much bigger than, I would say, our limited understanding of what faith is. So,
I think
No,
the questioner had the other part of it, the second sort of a follow-up. If someone is praying for somebody and the one they're praying for has no faith, do they receive the benefits of the prayers? I think that was part of the question. I think
oh,
you,
well,
well,
yes.
put it,
Yeah. I think it, and I'd be curious to know what Kathleen thinks. I mean, I think God pours out God's blessings on everyone.
well, that's one of the things that I found so really wonderful about your book, James, that you really started where I think
Really,
I probably would have started. Can we all mute? Ooh, yeah. Okay. You started out by inviting us to consider our image of God. And, you know, one of the things is that real prayer is going to transform that image, because God's going to break out of whatever straitjacket we've put God in within our prayer and surprise us. But I feel that there is such a huge challenge among us, particularly in the Christian form, because we are so image-based, that if there is a distortion in our image of God, the distortion is going to ripple through all of the fields of our human experience as well. So, you know, that question that we just heard, thank you for it. But it seems to come up from a place of projecting onto God a certain kind of stinginess, or a certain kind of having to pass the purity test or the righteousness test. And I think that, you know, the whole ministry of Jesus is about, I came to call sinners, not the pure, not the righteous, not the worthy. And so that's an important thing. And it's also, I think, important as we engage with a spiritual director like yourself, that we be called to identify where we're experiencing our God image shifting, our God consciousness.
No, I totally agree. And I think that one of them, and I talk about this in the book, one of the most challenging things is to see how people's image of God, as you were saying, Kathleen, influences everything, influences their prayer, influences their behavior. And many of us have an image of God that is usually related to the way our parents were, the way our mentors are, something we've been taught. And God is often much bigger than that. One of my favorite images of God came from a friend of mine who's an actress or an actor. And she said she often thinks of God as her parole officer, which is really, I mean, you know, you've already done something terrible. God's waiting for you to do something else that's terrible. And I often have to challenge people in spiritual direction when they say to me, for example, and how is it manifest? It's manifest in, for example, I did something bad and now my prayer life is dry, or something terrible is happening to me. I'm getting punished because this is the way God is. I've done something bad and now I'm being punished. You know, I'm sick, or I've lost my job, or something terrible has happened. And you have to say, what is your image of God? Is your image of God that of this kind of judgmental, stingy, as you said, great word, person, or this taskmaster, or this parole officer that's going to be punishing you for every minor infraction? Or is it something else? And what normally happens is I say, tell me experiences that you have had of God. And usually the person will say, well, I had this experience, you know, a few years ago where I just felt this great sense of calm. Okay, that's interesting. And tell me more about that. Well, it was this great sense of peace. I felt connected to the universe. I felt the sense of God's presence. And you say, well, that sounds really beautiful. So your direct experience of God is that God is a God of calm and peace. This happens over and over. Yes. Well, that doesn't sound like the God you're talking about. So it's the difference between your God in your head and God, right? And so, Kathleen, I'll take it even, you know, one step further. I think sometimes that those gods in our head are idols that need to be smashed, right? You don't have an idol before me. It's not this sort of God in your head. It's God, and you have to let God be God. And you're right. Jesus is doing this over and over again. You know, today in the Gospels, it's him setting aside the purity laws. And his image of God, what is his image of God? His image of God is, you know, like the prodigal father, something like that. It's just, it breaks all of our conventions. And so you're right. We have to continually be invited to see God in new ways.
Mhm.
We have a direct question for Father Jim. Another one of these tremendously sad stories. This is, I think, maybe for when you have to put your pastor's hat on again. A friend's son has died by overdose, and she's still unsure it wasn't suicide. She fears he will never go to heaven and be with God. COVID only makes it worse. What can you say to comfort her?
Well, I would also want to hear what Kathleen would say, but first of all, I'm sorry about your friend's loss. That's very sad. I believe in my own heart that God's mercy is more than we can imagine, you know, and Thomas Merton talks about mercy within mercy within mercy. And I believe that God understands the very complicated motivations that people have. And God is a God of all forgiveness and compassion. And I firmly believe this. And I think that people who, you know, who OD or even people who commit suicide are, you know, in a sense, not in their right minds. Right. And God has mercy on those people. So I don't think anyone is outside of God's mercy. I really don't. And I mean, this is, you know, Jesus praying for people, praying for the people who executed him from the cross, right? It's mercy within mercy within mercy. So I think that people who struggle with that, I understand that it's, you know, it's part of what they've been taught or how they've been instructed. But I think it's, again, to Kathleen's point, trying to open yourself up to new images of God. What would you say, Kathleen?
Well, first of all, I'm taking a lot of deep breaths because the circumstance is so heartbreaking and raw, and we all know, either by our experience or by our friendship with someone, the reality of that situation. And I think what I would say, James, I would thank you so much for going to Merton's words from the end of, is it the sign of Jonas? Mercy within mercy within mercy. I would say, allow yourself to embrace that child, that young person, and that parent, and allow your own grief and your own ferocious desire to comfort them become felt in you, and then multiply that by infinity. And I think that would be, how do I want to say this without blaspheming? That really would be the God of, at least the God of Jesus, and the God worthy of being called a God of love. We have to really let, in our prayer, in our experience, all of these, the straitjackets, all of these distortions, and as James said, these idols of God be swept away by the mighty compassion of our God. And if ever the living one needed apostles of divine compassion, I think it's now in this world.
Let me follow up on something Kathleen said, because it's such an important point. She talks about the ferocious love and compassion you have, and to see in that compassion God's compassion for your friend and for your friend's child, right? And so to see that as the way that God has of expressing compassion on earth, right? So to make that connection there, to know that what you're feeling is God's sadness as well.
Mm. It's beautiful.
Kathleen, Jim, we're getting two long questions about LGBTQ concerns. Did you want to go in that direction now, or do you have something?
That's fine. No, that's fine. It's fine. And
Okay.
whatever people want to know.
Yeah, this has to do with boys' high school,
Mm-hmm.
and there's what the quote is: open policy
Mhm.
about young men bringing other young men as dates to school dances. It's stirred some controversy. So far, no student, as we say, has taken them up on this offer. It seems to have made the policy to seem inclusive, but not to truly live this out. In the community, people are torn with this idea of being compassionate and having to follow church teachings. What recommendations do you have for this situation?
Yeah, I generally think that's not breaking any church teaching any more than having a boy and a girl go out on a date, because I mean, if you take it to to be practical, if we take it to its logical conclusion, the objection is, same-sex relations are wrong. Well, so are relations between, young men and young women before marriage. And no one has a problem with young men and young women going to a prom. So to me, I don't mean to denigrate it, but I think that's kind of a non-issue. I think it's something that the school needs to see, not as a threat to church teaching, because unless you want to bar young men and young women from going on dates, because theoretically that's what that would lead to as well. So yeah,
we have a follow-up, Jim, on the love the sinner, hate the sin.
Mm-hmm.
The person is concerned that the answer doesn't quite get to the issue. I'll read it verbatim so we don't miss nuance. If a close family member condemns homosexuality as a sin, but loves one, it doesn't negate the hurt one feels. It's not simple enough to respond, but we're all sinners. How does one both manage the personal pain of one's sexual orientation, condemnation, but also, practically speaking, respond to that condemnation?
Yeah, the very difficult question. I deal with that in my ministry a lot. One thing is to say that it is not a sin to be homosexual. That's the first thing. So, God created you this way. It is not a sin. So one of the things to do is to, unfortunately, challenge people who think that it is sinful simply to be born that way, right? I mean, even Pope Francis said to a friend of his, God created you this way. Oftentimes, I mean, this is obviously a situation with a younger person and a parent, or even a middle-aged person and a parent. And, it is, part of it is sometimes the inability to invite people to see that this is how God created you and that this is not sinful. God doesn't make, God, everything that God makes is beautiful, right? God makes us as beloved children. And I sometimes say, without knowing more about the details, that sometimes it's accompanying your parents, as they come to understand the person, to come to understand you, and to come to understand your sexuality. And oftentimes a young person, say a person who's in their 20s, may understand this better than the parent, right? Because they've been around people who are LGBT. And it's, in a sense, sometimes giving your parents the gift of time, right? Someone said to me that, kids who come out, let's say at 20, 25, they've had 25 years to think about it, if you think about it that way, right? Their parents might not have had that long, because they might not have thought about that for that long. They might have, 10 minutes to come to an understanding of it. And so, in a sense, can you give your parent the gift of time? It's a compassionate thing to do. But also, can you be, in a sense, free of the need for them right then to approve of you, right? It's a difficult situation. It's very difficult. I mean, this is why I'm doing this ministry, to help people see that, what we need to do is welcome people. And also, and if I'm speaking to any parents out there, to know that one of the key indicators of mental health for LGBT people is how their families accept them or don't accept them. So it's a really important thing to do, and a really important thing for, I think, the church to help educate people on this desire to welcome people as they are, as God created them.
Thank you, Jim. There's a change of direction now for one last question, if we have time. We're okay?
Yeah.
Father Jim, could you talk about praying for one's enemies, or people whom you so totally disagree with and disrespect?
Well, the first thing is Jesus asks us to do it. That's the first thing to remember. So it's not as if it's a kind of it's not an either. What am I trying to say?
Optional.
Thank you. It's a little late. It's not optional, and it's difficult, right? I mean, I have people who aren't, fond of me. I pray for them. I think one of the prayers that I've heard that has been really helpful is to pray to try to see the person the way God sees the person. And oftentimes that's with more compassion, a person who might be limited or angry or, maybe a little narrow-minded or closed-minded, to see them as God sees them. And that can give you a sense of compassion and also freedom, from the need, again, for them to like you or approve of you. But that prayer I find is one that is often answered. Pray to see this person the way that God sees them.
Mm.
And there's an Ignatian question. So we're back in your
Okay.
home ballpark here.
I think this will be the last question.
Okay.
And it's a repeat, but I think it's very helpful here. Could you talk about the Ignatian practice of finding God in all things, how you personally embody this practice in your life and your sense of the social and ecological implications of this practice?
Well, I hope I embody it. I try to, and it's something I know Kathleen is fond of, having gone through the exercises. I'd be curious to hear what her response is. It's basically looking at every moment of the day as a possible invitation from God. That's every person, everything you do, and in a kind of light way. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to kind of, in a sense, obsess about it, but just to say that God is available and inviting you in every moment of the day. And at the end of the day, to try to look back and see where you might have experienced God. What would you say, Kathleen, about finding God in all things?
Well, I think I love the answer you gave to another question about giving something the gift of time. And I think one of the things is giving ourselves the courtesy of patience, so that we might grow in our capacity to see God in all things and to see God everywhere. But to the degree I think that we're praying, and to the degree that we are immersing ourselves, or at least presenting ourselves to the presence of God, we become more and more receptive to that presence, and we become much more attuned. I think it's Ignatius's word, sentir, that the sense of divinity, the sense of God's presence, just so we can feel the sense of somebody you love. They have their own kind of presence. And I think that another thread that we weave into the Ignatian school comes from ever so many places, but it is the practice of the presence of God. That alone, that really is my morning prayer, is to really wake up in the morning to the presence of the presence that will be with me all day. And who said it? It could have been Daniel Berrigan. It's a little poem. I will greet him. I will greet you the days that I meet you, and bless when I understand. And I think that the intention, as you underscore so well in your book, the intention, to cultivate intention, to encounter God and to be receptive to God's desire for us. That's my takeaway from your book, by the way. That notion of God's desire for me, that it really took me by surprise. And that's what I would say. It's like Lala. I've said this before. I've said it to my students, the wonderful Hindi poet. And she said, her prayer is, wherever I go, I see your face, oh God. And the practice of that can be so powerful and whimsical too.
Well, let me say one more thing. I'm smiling because you said the presence of the presence. And I know that song from your album, which I love.
I love
So I when I think of that, I think of you, Kathleen. That's really something.
Thanks, James. Quillian, how long have we been on? I think we've been on for 2 hours or more, have we?
Almost 9 o'clock.
Oh, my Lord, we have to let this Jesuit go.
Let people go home and sleep.
Things to do.
Right.
Um,
You have some announcement. Did you want them made now? Or do you want to
well, could I just do a little wrap up
go
first?
ahead? Yeah.
James, I want to thank you so much. It was my dream to have you be a teacher within this new school of wisdom that I hope Earth and Spirit becomes. And I am so grateful to be in a vow of conversation with you. I just want to say that your ministry is going to aid all of us. I really encourage us to find James's book and to work with it, because we are all participating in this planetary spiritual renaissance that Thomas Merton has spoken about, that all the wisdom traditions are pointing to. And I think it's important that we have skillful means by which to do this. And the Ignatian school offers us such a thing. The other thing I want to say is you've heard Father Jim say so often, in spiritual direction, or in spiritual direction. You know, St. Bridget, whose feast we just celebrated, once said that a Christian or a spiritual person without an anamkara, or a spiritual guide, is like a person without a head. And I do encourage you to seek out companions for this spiritual journey and this journey of prayer. Hopefully we can do some more of this in our circles here. And I'm just talking because I don't want to let you go yet, but Jim, I want to thank you. And I want to thank everybody who came. I think we're about 200 at our max this evening. And may I ask a very wonderful tradition that we have. May we ask our priest to bless us?
Sure. And I want to say thanks to you, Kathleen, for your ministries. I listen to one of your ministries every morning as I get up, and your beautiful music, which I recommend to everyone I can possibly think of, but also this beautiful ministry you have of teaching and of bringing people into conversation, which is a really important way of teaching and learning. So maybe we just take a moment and be silent and grateful for this community that has been called together.
Mm-hmm.
Loving God, we thank you for calling us together tonight under the guidance of Kathleen. We thank you for the many gifts you've poured out on her, for her vocation as a musician and a teacher and a friend, and anamkara to all of us.
Mm.
We thank you for this beautiful institute and Iona College. And we thank you for, most of all, the gift of the Spirit in our lives, which brings us together.
Mm-hmm.
Help us to be attentive to the ways that you are at work in our lives. Help us to always remember that you are with us in all things. And we ask God to bless all of you in the name of the Father and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And we pass that out to the whole entire planet. So thank you all for being with us. Brother Colley's going to have some announcements. I just want to say stay tuned, because we will have some other remarkable teachers stepping into our community circle and practicing with us this vow of conversation. So good night to you.
And thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Jim. I should pass on to you that it's been a cascade of gratitude coming through the chat room as we're finishing up. So God bless you both for that. It's one of the ironies of our COVID life that here we are sending grace on the Wi-Fi and mercy in ways that we never could have imagined, maybe even a year ago. So that's the backwards blessing of our predicament. And thank you both for that. There are 3 little announcements about other events. These are all, of course, related to Kathleen's ministry, Iona College ministry. On Friday, there's a noontime gathering about the Biden presidency and Catholicism and US politics on Eagle's Wings. That's at 12 o'clock. Iona College website will have the particulars. On Saturday, February 13th, the Agape community, AGAPE, up in Massachusetts, will have a St. Bridget night, poetry, prayer, song. That starts at 7. There's a Zoom link on the Agape website. And then our own Thomas Berry Forum, Contemplative Ecologist Circle, every third Thursday. And this is the next one, February 18th, 7 o'clock. And again, Iona College Earth and Spirit website will have that link for you. We'd love you to join us for those evenings. Thanks again to all of you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all.
All right. God bless.
God bless
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you,
God bless
Kathleen.
you.
God bless.
God bless everyone.
Bye. Sorry for the abruptness as Zoom kills
Blessings
me.
all.
Everybody has to disappear at once. But you can say your goodbyes. As we'll give
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you all.
You're welcome,
Kathleen.
friend.
Thanks, everybody. It was
Thanks, everybody.
great,
Oh,
Kathleen and James.
It's a
Thank
great
You're
you.
welcome.
And
Thank
Kevin.
you.
Well, everybody.
Thank you.
From Canada.
Thanks for
Lots of
coming.
love.
Good.
Florida.
Thanks from nowhere.
I'll just give you a little music.
Mm.
Keep blowing kisses. That's what it's for, right?
Yep. Yeah, hi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
sister.
You're welcome. You're welcome, everybody. Hi, Marika.
Hi, Kathleen.
Great,
Wonderful.
Kathleen.
I'll join whenever I.
Jacqueline,
Thank you.
my joy.
Oh, hi. Great, Kathleen. Great. Great. Thank you, James.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Marika. How are you? I can see you. I didn't know it was all. What are we?
Hi,
all on one
Marika.
thing?
Hi, Jackie.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
This is the congregation of Notre Dame.
Oh,
just
how nice.
Right.
acting
Yeah.
out.
What a
Thanks,
wonderful
James.
evening.
Someone from Nairobi.
James-
Hello. Karibu.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well,
Great.
two from Kingston, Ontario.
Oh, wonderful.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah, Marika.
Yeah. Good.
And my beautiful brothers, Ed and Harry.
Yes,
Thank you
so much.
Good.
The cruelest part of COVID is that I can't
Yeah.
in your
Good.
embrace, your hugs.
I have.
We send them to
you. We send them to you.
Thank you, darling.
Thank you.
Love you so much.
Thank you. We love you.
Suzanne.
Yeah.
Hi.
I know.
Hi,
This
Libby.
is great.
Ashley. So
This
good
was
to
a
see
treat. Thank you.
Oh, so good to see your face.
You too.
All right, guys. I'll see you. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. This is beautiful.
We'll be in touch, my friend.
Yes, and I'll be listening to you tomorrow morning, as I always do.
That's
I
great.
just like, don't laugh, but when I heard that music, I thought, oh my gosh, it's time for me to get out of bed and get ready for the day. That's my morning music.
I remember being told by somebody that, Father James Martin said that you wake him up every morning. But, okay, let's
Oh my gosh. Well,
realize that.
as we say in the Jesuits, we will pass over that in silence. I'll see you guys. Thank you so much. God bless.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good
night, everyone.
night.
Bye. Have a good night.
Right. Good job. Good job.
Good job.
Yep.
Good job, darlings. Thank you
Okay.
all for being here.
That's great.
Ashley, you're as beautiful as ever.
So are you. It's so lovely to see you.
You too.
Mhm.
Have a
Monica,
good
thank you for everything. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you. It was beautiful.
Yeah. Good job, Monica.
Jackie.
I know, I can't see anybody, but I'm glad I can see you. I guess just one at a time.
I'm
I'm
scrolling.
using my phone, maybe.
Sorry.
Thanks, honey.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Blessings.
Good night, Joan
Good
Mahoney.
night now.
Good night.
Night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.